You mentioned your experience of teaching being an influence on your writing style, and you also, in the book, occasionally give examples of how your students, common opinion as manifested by students that you've taught. And I really wanted to ask you, because you teach at a secular university, about this is kind of an open-ended question, but I wanted to ask you about your experience of teaching there for over the decades, and how you deal with um, trying to teach abiding truths to disillusioned students.
Well, it's tough, but on the other hand, it's tough to teach in a committed Christian environment too, because many of the kids who are there, they may be there because their parents just thought that they have to go there, or they may be there and be thinking, "Oh, these people are just droning all these platitudes in my mind." There are problems. There are problems in both kinds. I think it's wonderful that there are Catholic universities, and I think some people are called to teach in them. I suspect that I'm more likely to have a calling to teach out in the secular wasteland, and it has its own challenges. But one of the things that I've been surprised to find is that although my secular students, my skeptical students, my non-believing students may not be aware of their own spiritual longings, by golly, they've got them. And if I don't bring up God in a course on a course dealing with ethics, well, they'll bring him up. Sometimes in the funniest ways. I was teaching a course once, and there was a unit on Thomas Aquinas. We were getting ready to close out the unit. We were about two-thirds or three-quarters of the way through it, and a student raised his hand in class and said, "Did Thomas Aquinas believe in God?" Uh, Now, okay, if you are far enough from that perspective, even reading it right on the page, it may be hard to see it. It may be hard to take it in. It may be hard to believe it, and people may need a little help to see that. But people will ask, and I think that it's if I just tried to lay down the gospel on them, I'd be abusing my position because they didn't pay their money to take that class for that reason. But if I can respond to questions, and if something about the gospel gives the answer to that, then I think that that's perfectly reasonable. I'll tell you a story, Thomas, about a student came to me once. I had not mentioned God, but I had been teaching Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, which you mentioned that you've been reading recently. And my student, he was an older returning student. He was in his 30s. He showed up at my office door during office hours, and he said, "Professor, can I talk with you?" He said, no, that's not what he said. He said, "I gotta talk with you." I said, "Well, okay, what do we gotta talk about?" He said, "Well, you're scaring me." And I said, "Well, how am I scaring you?" And he said, "Well, it isn't really you. It's this guy Aristotle that you're making us read." And I said, "Well, how's Aristotle scaring you?" And he said, "Well, in this book of his, he keeps talking about the virtues. And it's making me realize that I haven't led a virtuous life, and I'm scared."
Hmm.
And he held out his hand. He was a melodramatic guy, but I believe him. The melodramatic drama was illustrating a truth about him. His hand was trembling. He was, he was, now, had Aristotle spoken of divine judgment, of retribution, of guilt, of God, of conviction of sin? No, what he'd been talking about is the virtues, and he'd been talking about them in connection with human flourishing. The worst that my student would have concluded is that if he didn't practice the virtues, he wasn't going to flourish.
Hmm.
But he was trembling. That was the first that I'd realized that the Holy Spirit, could make use of an old pagan philosopher to bring about what John's Gospel calls the conviction of sin.
Wow.
So, it's always a surprise. These people, the wheat is in the fields. It's growing up. It's waiting for the harvesters.
Have you had any instances of actual conversion taking place, or I don't even not mean just to the Catholic faith, but even in a more limited sense?
Yes, in a more limited sense, and in that sense, I've seen people become at least theists. I've seen people become Christians of some kind. I've seen people become Catholics. I've also seen people at least lose some of their barriers, some of their blinders, who had held certain stereotypes. For instance, that there couldn't possibly be any right and wrong, everything is all relative, or that even if there are some truths about this, you couldn't give any rational arguments for it, or that no intelligent person really believes in God. And then they read somebody like Thomas Aquinas, and all right, this is obviously an intelligent person. They're seeing these arguments, whether or not they can absorb and digest at that age every little wrinkle of his arguments. Still, they get the main idea, and they say, wait, there's something compelling here. Does that necessarily convert them? No, but it makes them a little bit more willing to listen. And then the next guy in the row, may be able to do more. So often I realize that by the time I talk to a student, there's somebody else who came long before me, who planted some kind of a seed, and I get a chance to water it a little bit maybe. And maybe it's not me who gets a chance to harvest it, somebody else does. And that's pretty thrilling, and it's pretty exciting. And even when somebody is extremely resistant and has a very closed mind, that's not necessarily a bad thing for the class. It's not good for that student, of course, but it can be a good thing for the class in odd ways. A student started screaming once in class merely because I'd given my students didn't know what a partial birth abortion was. And I hesitated. I didn't want to dump things on them, but I said, would you like me to give you a definition? He said, yeah, they all wanted a definition. So I gave a one sentence, purely clinical. I promise you it was not emotionally loaded or value loaded definition of the procedure. A woman starts screaming. And she was screaming about how it was only done to save the life of the mother. And I said, well, actually, that claim was made by somebody in congressional testimony about partial birth abortions recently, but he admitted afterward that he'd perjured himself. He was an abortionist, and she just started screaming louder. Well, we had been talking about the framers' ideas about passion and interest and virtue, and about their fears that passion could overcome discourse. So I just turned to the class and I said, do you see why the framers were concerned about passion in discussion? She turned off like a switch, which is very interesting because it illustrated to me and also to many of the listeners, the other students in the class, that on the one hand, I'm sure that the woman's pain was real. What it is that she was hurting about, I don't know. I'm sure that it was real, but she was also using it strategically. She was making use of her own pain to gain points. There was another occasion on which a student became angry with me in class. Somebody had asked a question about God. It wasn't what I was lecturing about, but he'd asked a question about God, and I answered the question. And another student is getting angry, and I said, why are you angry? Well, Texas students are very polite, God bless them. And he said, I'm sorry. And I said, I'm not scolding you. I'm not saying stop being angry. I'm just asking you. I really want to know, why are you angry? He said, well, I guess it's because I disagree with you. And I said, well, I disagree with you. I'm not angry with you, so that couldn't be it, could it? And he said, well, I guess it's because I don't want to hear what you're saying. And I said, okay, well, then what we really need to talk about, and we don't need to do that right now, and you don't even have to do it with me, but what you really want to think about is not whether the answer that I gave about God or whatever we were talking about is correct. What you really need to think about is why you don't want to hear it. Now, that's useful. There was something was gained there.
Wow, that's great. Yeah, these are awesome stories, actually. It sounds like a real place of spiritual warfare.
Well, sometimes, most of the time, half the students are asleep and things just sort of go along smoothly.
No, but that's fascinating. That's really fascinating. I wanted to ask, and this may seem like an odd question, but a smart student who engages with a philosopher like Aristotle, but is committed to a life of vice and not interested in changing, they might incorporate his thought in perverse ways, or they might respond in ways that you wouldn't necessarily expect and take it in a perverse direction. I know this is a very vague question, but I'm curious if you've seen any examples of that.
It's not vague at all. No,
Yeah.
I no,
Okay.
I think that is absolutely true. Knowledge is a wonderful thing, but if you aren't actually seeking knowledge, then it can be a snare. It's not for nothing that Saint Paul mocks the pretensions of what the world sometimes calls philosophy, the false wisdom of the world. You know, I've had students who read the classics, but they're not really looking for the truth. They're just looking for sometimes esoteric meanings that only great scholars can find in the texts, and it's just to build up pride, you see. It's not actually
Hmm.
to find the truth. There are people who think, oh, I'm going to read all of this because the good life is the life spent in seeking for the truth but not finding it. It's the
Hmm.
seeking that is the good, not the finding of it, as various writers, including C.S. Lewis and G.K. Chesterton, have pointed out. That's like saying the good thing is about being hungry, not actually having a hamburger. It's there's also the fact that if you're trying to teach ethical philosophy to somebody who doesn't have a modicum of virtue, who isn't at least trying some to be a good person, he may use what he learns to construct clever arguments in order to evade the truth instead of to seek it. And we see that in history too. Look, when Pontius Pilate is in conversation with Jesus, and at a certain point, you know, Jesus speaks about the truth, and Pontius Pilate says, "What is truth?" It sounds like a question, right? It wasn't. It was a conversation stopper disguised as a question. He didn't use that to begin a conversation. He used it to end a conversation. And it was at that moment that he turns on his heel and he walks out of the room.
Hmm.
I think one of the things that we have to learn in conversation and as teachers, and we have to learn to catch ourselves at this too, because we all have at times have evaded the truth and been and out clevered ourselves. We need the grace of God to keep us away from that. But sometimes a question is a real question, and what it needs is an honest intellectual answer. Or if we don't have the answer, what it needs is, well, I don't know, I'll help you, let's work together to find out. But sometimes a question isn't. It's a smokescreen. It's a way of being clever. It's a way of avoiding the answer. And one of the things that I've had to learn as a teacher, even as a writer, Socrates got this. It isn't just a matter of presenting a bunch of syllogisms. The dialogues sometimes sound more like the discussions of somebody with a very wise counselor. People are getting angry. They're evading things. They're changing the subject. They're committing the bizarrest fallacies of distraction. And we do this. Or you look in the Gospels. You look at Jesus' conversation with the woman at the well. It used to baffle me because it's full of what on the face of it look like non sequiturs. Um, he doesn't exactly answer what she says in her words, and she doesn't exactly answer what he says in his words. It's a sort of a duel. He's responding to what's behind her words, and she's trying to duel, and he finally wins, and she's disarmed and goes to the town and says, "You've got to hear this man. He's he knows everything about me. Do you think he could be the Messiah?" That's an amazing conversation, but it isn't the way. But it's nothing like the way that we teach young teachers to teach in pedagogy courses, just explaining things step by step and presenting syllogisms. There's other stuff going on because you're dealing with a real mind here, a real soul and a real heart, and the mind needs to be in partnership with those things and not at odds with it.